Alrighty. Thank you all for coming. I'm Summer. I'm the curator here at the museum. Before we get started, everybody please take a second to turn off or silence your phones so we don't have any distractions. For announcements, we will be having our annual Community Appreciation Day on Saturday, July 23rd. So mark your calendars for that. We'll be having kids activities outside in the parking lot, as well as live music with Hup and Ray. And admission to the museum is free all day that day. So come out, we'll have the activities from 10 to 2. And I might turn off that fan, it's like blowing me. The other big announcement is we've been working with the city and Peck Alumni Association to create a permanent exhibit about the history of Peck High School. And it'll be at the Peck Center. It is installed now, but we just have a few more tweaks. And the grand opening will be on August 13th, and it'll be open to the public from 2 to 5 that day. So be sure to come out for that. For upcoming programs, our August brown bag lunch on the 3rd will be with Taylor Clem, who is the Nassau County Horticulture Extension Agent and Master Gardener Volunteer Coordinator. His talk is called Becoming a Lazy Gardener, and he talks about issues with overloving your landscape, so he'll probably have a bunch of good tips. And then our August 3rd on the 19th will be with Calvin Bryant, who will speak about Jean Ribaud, who was one of the early French settlers here. So that's it for announcements, but tonight I am the speaker, so I'll introduce myself a little bit more. I completed my master's in museum studies at the University of Florida in 2019, and I continued working there for about a year in their library's special collections department. I worked in a collection that was focused on the American era of the Panama Canal. And then I moved here in December 2020, and my position is curator, so I schedule our monthly programs, and I also research and write the temporary exhibits downstairs. But I also get to do fun projects like work on the Peck exhibit. So as I mentioned in announcements, we've been working on this project for about a year. And my role in the project was to research the history of Peck, write all the text, select the images. So this talk is drawing very much from the research I did through the exhibit. And while the exhibit focuses on the entire history of the school from the inception in the 1880s up until the closure of the school in 1969 and the subsequent, restoration and so on. In this talk, I'm only going to be focusing on the early history. The early history, and in this talk I focus on the 1880s when the school was created, up until the 1920s when the new building on 10th Street was built, the building that's still standing today, the Peck Center. And I'm focusing on this section because it was by far the most challenging part of the history to research. There's several secondary sources written about the early history, but some of them have conflicting information and so on, and there's no really academic history written about it with citations and everything. So we did a lot of primary source research for this section, and it was really fun to me. So I'm going to be kind of walking you through the types of sources we were looking at and what types of things we were able to find out. So if you don't know, just a little bit of very basic background information on Peck High School is that it was the African American school, grades 1 through 12, so it wasn't just high school grades, in Fernandina during the segregation period. It closed in 1969 when Nassau County Schools desegregated, and it was subsequently preserved. And the building is now known as the Peck Center. It's owned by the city of Fernandina Beach, and it houses government offices, nonprofit offices, and soon a small museum exhibit. So, in this talk, I am basically going to be looking at the early history through the lives of these three men who were significant to the history. So we have Henry Beard Delaney. He was the person who petitioned to establish Colored School No. 1, which was Peck High School's predecessor. We have William Henderson Peck, who was the second principal and was extremely influential to the growth of the school. And then we have Julius Rosenwald, who contributed to the establishment of the new Peck building on 10th Street through the Roosevelt Fund. So if you look at their years of birth and death, and I don't know if you guys can see back there, but they're all born in the mid-1800s. So they were all contemporaries of one another, all born within a few years of one another. And so looking at their lives also allows us to kind of see the very different things that were going on in the United States at the same time. So the first section is Henry Beard Delaney. He helps us get a glimpse of the context of the school's creation. So if you've been living in Fernandina for a while, you may have heard of the Delaney family. They're a very prominent African-American family here. As you can see from the caption, Henry Beard Delaney became a bishop. You may have also heard of Emma Beard Delaney, who was a Baptist missionary in Africa. And there's many others in the Delaney family who lived really accomplished lives. But Henry Beard Delaney was born in 1858 in St. Mary's, Georgia. And he was born into slavery. He was a slave. But his father, Thomas Sterling Delaney, was a free black man, and he was very successful. He was a shipbuilder, a landowner, traveler, and Methodist minister. And a little bit of just historical context for the time is, you may remember from history classes, during slavery, enslaved people were subjected to anti-literacy laws, making it illegal for them to learn to read or write. So Henry Beard Delaney is born right before this starts to change. He's born at the very end of the antebellum period. So in 1861, the Civil War starts, and in 1862, Union forces seized Fort Clinch here in Fernandina. Here's a picture of Fort Clinch, modern day, making Fernandina a relatively safe place for African Americans. And then 1 year later, in 1863, when Henry was only 5 years old, his father led his family across the St. Mary's River to Fernandina to safety. And a little bit more context. You might remember these from your history classes. With the end of the Civil War, we have the Reconstruction Amendments. So they were designed to guarantee the rights of freed slaves. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment had to do with citizenship. It ensured that previously enslaved people became citizens of the United States. And then the 15th Amendment gave suffrage to male African Americans. Let's see where we are. So these amendments ushered in the Reconstruction Period, which is often referred to by historians as like the Reconstruction Experiment, after the Civil War, when America was trying to figure out how to be organized. So it was a brief period in which African Americans were able to vote and accumulate political power. And obviously after that, it's followed by Jim Crow, in which all of these rights are, again, restricted. So we have Chloe Merrick. After the Civil War, churches were active in the education of free African Americans. And here in Fernandina, Henry Delaney received his early education from the Episcopal Church, and he was likely taught by Chloe Merrick. She's a big name in the history here. I think we have some stuff about her in the permanent exhibits downstairs. And if you're familiar with the Merrick Simmons house downtown, that's where she lived, right, Melissa?
Yes.
Yeah. So Chloe Merrick was a Freedmen's Bureau educator from Syracuse, New York, who later became the First Lady of Florida. So the Reconstruction era in Fernandina, it was a period between 1870 and 1902 in which African American city councilmen were actually elected 48 times to the local government here. So that kind of shows the vitality of the rights that African Americans had in Fernandina during that time. But of course, during the Reconstruction period, white Southerners were working to roll back these advancements. So, you know, the KKK is founded during the Reconstruction period, and white Southerners were also working to bar black people from voting, and Jim Crow laws were soon to be entrenched. And after this era, there wouldn't be another African American in this position until 1978, when Charles Albert was elected as a city commissioner. So that just kind of showed some of the historical context for the time we're looking at. But this is the first really important document specifically related to what would become Peck High School. It's the first mention of what would become Peck High School that I've seen, and it's also what ties Henry Delaney to Peck. And so I'll read starting here. There was a gathering in which African American leaders were speaking, and it says, "The speeches all aimed to impress upon the colored people the importance of higher education and an entire breaking off from the traditions and practices of the past. H.B. Delaney," that's Henry Beard Delaney, "offered a resolution as follows. Resolved that for the higher religious, educational, and intellectual training of the race, the Reverends Brookins, Delaney, Ferguson, Cole, Ballard, Davis, and Holland be deputed as agents of these orders to make arrangements for the erection of a high school building in the city. This resolution, we understand, was adopted." So prior to this, there was some education of lower grades, but this is to make a high school. And this school that they're talking about would become colored school number 1. So the school came into existence in the 1880s during this brief period in which African Americans were holding local government positions in Fernandina. And this newspaper clipping shows, you know, the value and interest in education among the black community at the time. But just 16 years after that article was written, we have the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which upholds state-imposed Jim Crow segregation laws. And it rules that accommodations for African Americans are, African Americans and white could be separate as long as they were equal. So this, of course, also applies to the school system. So increased pressures from white Southerners led to the disenfranchisement of black voters, reversing the gains that had been made during Reconstruction. However, despite unequal opportunity, education remained an important tool for advancement. And so this is where I'll close the very first section on Henry Beard Delaney. But because of the educational opportunities he was offered during this period, he became the first Black person elected as bishop suffragan of the Episcopal Church of the United States. Let me get this. So this is another Florida Mirror article, and if you don't know, the Florida Mirror is what the news leader used to be called, so it's same newspaper. So this is from 1886, and it is talking about Colored School Number 1, the school that Henry Beard Delaney petitioned to create. And it's saying that a representative of the Mirror visited the school, and it's talking about how impressed they are by the school, and they're impressed by Mr. M.M. Payne, who is the leader of the school. And then it's saying, you know, it's a shame that this school is privately funded and that they think that this school should receive public funds. So clearly M.M. Payne is an important name to look into. So same year, I think, yeah, 1886, he shows up in the Fernandina directory. It shows that he's a teacher. His name is spelled a little bit differently, but same person. And these are the types of sources that we went through to try to learn about these people. Here is the business directory from 1887. You can see highlighted here, school number 2, M.M. Payne principal, and now it's listed under public schools. So evidently they did receive public funding. Oh, and this is, so in the secondary sources, Peck High School's predecessor is almost always called Colored School Number 1. But what I found in the research is that the name was very variable. So here it's referred to as School Number 2. And that's 1887. If we look at this Sanborn fire insurance map from 1891, you can see, I'll use this one. It is right here, Schoolhouse Number 2. And this was the school's original location. It's near the corner of Center. This part of Center is now Atlantic Avenue and 11th. And then a few years later, in 1899, these are school board meeting notes, and they refer to it as Colored School Building Number 1. And then 1903, another Sanborn map right here, Colored Schoolhouse Number 2. So I don't really understand, you know, the naming practice of it, but it's something I noticed. And so regardless of the name, you can see it at this consistent location. And Colored School Number 1 was apparently a 4-room wooden schoolhouse. To my knowledge, no photographs of it exist, but it may have looked something like this. This was the Franklintown 1-room schoolhouse. So Colored School Number 1 would have been a little bit bigger, but just like a basic wooden schoolhouse. So if we're focusing on M.M. Payne, Moses Payne, if he was the first principal of the school, why is his name like basically erased from the records? You know, why is it called Peck High School instead of Payne High School? Well, the reason is that he only served as principal very briefly, and he died very young. So those sources I was just showing you were from 86 and 87, but you can see here, this is his headstone. He died in 1888, and he was only 28 years old. He reportedly died from yellow fever. That's what I've seen a lot. I haven't seen like any primary sources about that, but I'm interested in how people know that, you know. Okay, so with the death of Professor Payne, William Henderson Peck rises to the leadership position of the school. So here's a picture of him. All the photographs I've seen of him look pretty similar to this. He's like very serious and dignified. And this is consistent with how the alumni describe him in oral histories. So in starting this research project, I'd heard that both Payne and Peck were students at Howard University, the famous HBCU. And we were able to find the rosters for the years that they attended. So I have the years listed on the slide. Payne attended between 1882 and 1886, and Peck attended between 1883 and 1887. So apparently Payne, since we saw him in the directories in 1886, apparently he came like directly from school to work at Colored School number 1. I have no idea about his history before then. I don't know what his connection was to Fernandina, but that's what happened. And then Peck came down here as soon as he graduated a year later. So I presume that they knew each other at Howard University up in Washington, just because their years overlap so much and they, you know, clearly had some tie to each other. Oh, and this is the Howard roster. You probably can't see this at all, so I'll point it out. This one shows William H. Peck, and it shows that he's associated with Dublin, Virginia. Okay, so a little bit of background on William Peck. I read that he was born a slave, and the previous document showed that he was associated with Dublin, Virginia, and he was born in 1859. So this is a slave schedule from 1860, and it is from Montgomery County, Virginia, which is really close to Dublin, Virginia. And just to orient you to it a little bit, it says here, names of slave owner, number of slaves, age, sex, color. Okay, so if you look right here, it says William H. Peck. And when I saw that, I was like, I don't know what that means, but it feels like these parts are related somehow. So I reached out to one of the docents here at the museum, John Bryant. He's a retired professional historian, and he worked around this era. So I sent it to him with a little bit of background, and I said, you know, does this mean anything to you? And he said, what you found is not unusual. One of the best ways for a free person to protect enslaved family members was to own them. And so looking at the ages of the enslaved people under William H. Peck, which, you know, perhaps could have been William Peck of Fernandina's father, it seems that that could be like an extended family unit. And since this is from 1860, if you look at the very last listing, it says one slave, year, 1 year old, male, black. So, I mean, perhaps that could be William Peck of Fernandina. I don't have anything conclusive about that at all, but I thought it was interesting enough to include. Okay. So Peck was reportedly a very private person who didn't seek attention for the important work he did for the African American community. So much of his personal life has been lost to history. But in looking through the documents, there's some like curious things, like this is from 1901, and it shows here Peck, William H., and it lists him as a grocer. So, and 1901 would have been 14 years after he became principal at Colored School number 1. So that's another thing where I don't know why he was listed as a grocer. I don't know if he was a grocer, but I thought it was interesting enough to include. Professor Peck reportedly had a strong hand in the school's advancement, holding summer school classes to train teachers on staff. This photo is from 1931. This is him here with a group of students. Board of Education records show Peck requesting assistance for opportunities such as attending the National Congress for Colored Educators in Washington, D.C. And another big thing he did for the school was extend the grades offered up until the 12th grade. So previously, the original high school didn't have all of the high school grades. And here's another picture of him, same day, 1931, but now there he is. Now he's with the faculty. Whoops. So a little bit about the funding between the black schools and the white schools. Throughout the Board of Education documents, you can see Peck regularly getting paid less than his white counterparts. You can also see things like secondhand furniture being passed down from the white schools to the black schools. And these practices continued all throughout Peck High School's history. So I have listed here in 1901, the principal of the white school's salary was $90 per month. And then 8 years later, William Peck's salary is $75 per month. And then a year later, it lists him requesting an increase of his salary, and the request was denied. So that's just something that goes through the history of the school, unfortunately. A little bit about the name change. So this is a document from 1916, and this paragraph right here says, a petition from the colored citizens asking that the Fernandina High School number 1 colored be changed to the name of Peck High School. Same was granted by the board. So this was an important find in the research because previously 1911 was always cited as the year that the name changed from colored school number 1 to Peck High School. I think that was kind of carried down through like oral tradition, but we were really excited to find definitively, you know, what year the name was changed. And most all of these things that I'm showing you are documents that are held at the Nassau County Board of Education. So here is just another map showing the name change. This is from 1926. But you can see that the school is still in the same original location at Center and 11th, but it says here Peck High School. And then this one's kind of cool because it has some annotations. So it says down here, William H. Peck, William H. Peck. I'm not sure, but those may have been like properties he owned or something. Let's see. Okay, these are just some quotes about the type of person Peck was. I like this second one by Maple Pratt. She says, he was wonderful, he was very fair, and he walked like he had a bone down his back. He insisted every Friday the boys that was in 12th grade wore ties to church to school. And he insisted every senior every Friday, one by one, had a ditty they had to speak on something in chapel exercise in order to give them some sense of facing the public. And so all of the quotes are kind of talking about the way Professor Peck like prepared them for adulthood. And That's something that the younger alumni of Peck High School really talk about too, is that, you know, they received this intellectual education from Peck High School, but they also really received like a moralistic education from Peck High School. So I think it's cool that you can see like the seeds of that in Professor Peck's example. Okay, so the last section is Julius Rosenwald. And here he is. He was born in 1862, just 3 years after Peck and 4 years after Delaney. He was the son of Samuel Rosenwald, who immigrated from Germany to Baltimore, Maryland in 1851. And when he was 10, he was sent to New York City to be an apprentice to his uncles in the men's clothing business. So he later moved to Chicago and started Rosenwald and Weil in 1885, which is the same year that Public School No. 1 opened. And then 10 years later, he became partners with Richard Sears of Sears, Roebuck and Company. So Rosenwald was an excellent leader who brought Sears under more efficient management. And when Richard Sears resigned in 1809, Rosenwald became the president and chairman of the board. And under his leadership, Sears became the largest retailer in the United States. And all throughout this process, Rosenwald is amassing like an enormous fortune. So Rosenwald was Jewish, and he believed in the Jewish ideal of tzedakah, which signifies charity and justice. And he became very interested in helping African Americans. He identified with their struggles as another member of a minority group that faced discrimination. And he began funding YMCAs for African Americans across the country. And because of this work, he was invited by Booker T. Washington to speak at Tuskegee Institute. And this actually led to an invitation for Julius Rosenwald to serve on the board of Tuskegee. So there they are together. And here is a letter from Rosenwald to Booker T. Washington in 1911 accepting the invitation for him to become a board member of Tuskegee. So Rosenwald asked Booker T. Washington what would be beneficial for the black community, and Booker T. Washington pointed out the need for schools for African American children in rural communities. So Rosenwald and Washington agreed to erect 6 small schools, and this was the beginning of what would become the Rosenwald Fund. So Rosenwald received photographs of these original 6 schools, and he was, you know, really excited by them and the difference they were making in these communities. So they continued to erect schools all across the South. And these schools were based on Washington's direction, where they should be, and Rosenwald's funds. However, in order to ensure community buy-in, Rosenwald didn't fund the entire schools. Instead, he funded just a third of the schools. The remaining third was to be acquired from the white community, typically from boards of education. And then the final third was to be raised within the black community. So these schools were often built by the students themselves, and so they oftentimes became like the center of those small rural communities. And here's an example of some of the Rosenwald schools. I don't know where. I just pulled some from Google. I don't know where they're from. But they're all Roosevelt Schools. And you can see that they look very consistent, right? And they look very different from Peck High School. So I'll explain why in a second. So here is a map of all the different buildings that the Rosenwald Fund contributed to. Rosenwald eventually centralized the management of the fund and named it the Rosenwald Fund. It was based out of Nashville, Tennessee. And it helped, by the end of the fund in 1932, it had helped establish almost 5,000 rural schools in 15 southern states. If you look at the count up here, it has a few more than 5,000. That's because they also funded some buildings that weren't schools. But this just really shows how many schools they funded. It's very impressive. So let's see. So yeah, the brick building that is now the Peck Center was one of these Rosenwald schools, still is one of these Rosenwald schools. And this is a deed to purchase that land on 10th Street. It is from 1927. It's also held at the Board of Education. So, built in 1927, Peck High School's Rosenwald building was constructed towards the end of the Rosenwald Fund and exhibits several differences from the previous builds because of this. So while the initial Rosenwald buildings were small wooden schoolhouses constructed by the community, Peck is a larger brick structure that was constructed by a construction company. And by the late 1920s, the fund had also rescinded its previous 1/3 practice, and it was encouraging school districts to provide the majority of the funding. So for Peck, the Rosenwald Fund only provided $2,100 for Peck's construction, while a tax bond provided almost $57,000. And you can see those expenses in the Board of Education documents. So this was kind of a notable find in the research as well, because in some of the secondary sources, it did list that Rosenwald had contributed just $2,100, but in other sources, it said a number way higher than that, so we were happy to find something definitive. It says here, the secretary reported the fact of a possible contribution of $2,100 from the Rosenwald Fund building to be applied to building number 2 for colors. So this also kind of shows the difference from the previous buildings, because originally the Rosenwald schools were constructed because of the fund, whereas this one was already going to be constructed, but they were just taking advantage of the fact that they could pull from this fund. So, designed by Jacksonville architect Roy A. Benjamin, who is actually the same architect who designed the museum that we're in, which was the old Nassau County Jail. Peck's new building was completed in 1928. Joseph Irving, a alumnus of the school, describes walking to the school in this quote. He says, they had a parade downtown and we carried the flag down Center Street. We walked to this new building and that was the first time we entered the building. When we came here, everywhere you looked was nothing but woods. But as you know, Peck High School in that new building would ultimately become very much the center of the Black community. So it's interesting to see here, when it started, it was just the middle of nowhere, but it really grew up because of that school. So that is where I'll end the talk. If you want to learn more about the rest of the history, you can go to the exhibit. And I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have, but we also have some alumni in the house, so maybe if I don't know the answer, they can help.
Question.
Yes.
Where is Payne's headstone located?
I'm not sure. I haven't seen it in person, but so it is in Boscobello, according to grades.com. Yeah. Yes. But I haven't seen it in person. Yeah.
Is the original building still around, or is that in the...
No, it isn't. And I'm not sure when it was demolished, but there's nothing really on that lot currently. It's kind of behind that gas station on 11th. Yeah.
Just looking at that location for the original school.
Yeah.
It's right by what's called the Central Park. And right across from the water plant, city-owned, just a block or so away from the white Fernandina school.
Yeah.
So it was in even though it might have been a wooden building and not adequate, it was in a prominent city location, just off Center Street, and you see Peck owning property right around it. You see kind of like it might have been the African American community in the center of Fernandina. When Peck School is built, I mean, it's a grand location. A lot of, ball fields and everything around it. Certainly they didn't have in the old location. But I'm wondering, was it an attempt to push the African American community away from downtown and away from the white schools, or was it just because there was a whole bunch of land there?
I really don't know the answer to that. The only thing I've read is that, they wanted to build a larger school. So I know it was because of that, but in terms of, the social, racial aspect of it, I really don't know.
I've got a possible answer for you, because close to where that school is very close to it. And actually, in conjunction with this project, we're producing a brochure about important African American history sites. So the school that Colony Merritt had was part of the Finnegan estate. And it's very close to where that school number 1. Or it used to be. That building is no longer there. It was right behind where the current school board is, which is very close to the same area. So, and you've got to remember, that was actually sort of on the outskirts of town at that point. All those houses you see in Atlanta, those were all built in the 1950s. Yeah. So that was really sort of on the outskirts of town. So I would say that's probably because it's very close to where that original Chloe Merritt School was. That's why it was there.
Yeah.
Was American Beach in existence then?
Not yet. It came in the 1930s. Yeah.
But did students from Franklintown start going to Peck then? Because that's down near American Beach, right? It's down where the
that's where the plantation is. I mean, it seems like a lot of these communities were very localized, but I don't know. Joe.
It seems like the original school was so small, and then this Peck School is just gigantic. The population of the school had grown that much in the ensuing time.
Well, the original Peck School wasn't quite as big. They expanded it in the 1950s. But yeah, it is, it's way bigger than a 4-room schoolhouse. But I would imagine so, or maybe the first one was just inadequate in general, so even without a population increase, they just needed more space.
Was this building always a brick building, or did it start out as...
Which one? Which building?
The building you're in now.
It was always brick,
It was always brick.
Yep.
Actually, way back in the day, it was originally wood. And then this.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Prior to this, it was originally a wooden structure.
The one built in the 1800s. So kind of a very parallel story is that this building was originally a wooden structure, and then around the same time, the 1920s, 30s, this brick building was built.
They had a fire in Fernandina. And they had a fire, and after that fire, all of the buildings that were new construction had to be put in the downtown area. So it was around that time that this became a brick structure.
In your research, did you come across any information about the Sisters of St. Joseph and their African-American school?
I didn't like in the Board of Education stuff, but that would have been like a interesting piece to explore as well. But I haven't looked into that a ton. But yeah, they were working at around the same time with the yellow fever epidemic and everything.
They came to Fernandina to start a school.
Mm-hmm.
So before there was a St. Michael, before there was a St. Joseph Academy, they came to teach African Americans.
Mm-hmm.
One final question. Oh, just a comment about Delaney. He ended up as a professor, I think, at St. Paul's College in North Carolina, an African American college. And that's where he was petitioned.
Yeah, in Raleigh, North Carolina, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where he went to school as well.
It was called St. Augustine.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
North Carolina.
Yeah.
You said there was some alumni from Peck. I'd like to hear if just when they graduated maybe and what it was like there. What it was.
You know they're not supposed to tell their age.
If you guys are willing to, but definitely don't have to if you don't want to.
Okay.
No. But we had a program a few months ago in which we had several alumni talk about their experiences, and it's on YouTube, and if you would like to watch it, you can. It's on the Amelia Island Museum of History YouTube channel. Yes.
Were the students from restricted to Fernandina Beach, or were they bused in from any other place, or?
So in this period, I don't know. I know later they were definitely bused in, like students from Bryant Academy in Yulee were bused into Peck High School, but that was in, the 50s, 60s. But in this early period, I'm really not sure. Again, the early period was very much the most difficult part to research, because in the later period, we can just, ask alumni what was it like. But in this period, we can't. So there's a lot of unknowns about it still. Yes.
When Francis Floyd talked, he mentioned the development of transportation and the timber industry, moving students from newly arrived to Peck, and truckers picking up basketball students after their late games and practices and dropping them off back at Floyd School. This would have been in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, it's a shame that they had to travel so long just to get to school.
I mean, the generosity of the truckers was.
Yeah, definitely.
Transportation.
Yeah. Joe, you have another question?
Yeah, I'm impressed with, the amount of energy you put into all the original research for this. How long did it take you doing this presentation?
Well, this presentation wasn't that hard because I had already done so much of the research, but I've been working on this project for like a year. So it definitely was a lot. And I have to shout out Rhonda and Brianna. They were the ones who actually went to the Board of Education and went through the documents and, without barely reading anything, they're just skimming for anything Peck, anything colored school, just taking a picture of everything. So, I'm sure there's a ton more in those documents that we could learn from, but it's difficult to do when it's not digitized.
When you have a staff of 4 full-time people. And don't have a whole department.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.